Welcome to this webinar on youth partnerships on research and data, a game changer for an inclusive COVID-19 response. This chat is organized through the United Nations Development Programme's Community of Practice on governance and on health and HIV. My name is Maria Stage. I'm a program analyst in UNDP's Bureau for Policy and Program Support, and I will be moderating this discussion. In this chat, we will hear from partners and colleagues about their work on youth perception studies in Western Balkans, youth participation in evidence-based policy research on health and governance in Africa, and partnerships with young people to utilize data on sustainable development goals for advocacy and engagement in the Arab states. We have organized this COP chat with you all to connect research findings with policy and program support, and also to share lessons learned on how to co-create research and data with young people and its relevance for COVID-19 response. So it is my hope that this chat will spark ideas for all of us on how to promote evidence-driven policies, programs and services with and for young people, ideas on how to encourage meaningful youth participation through data collection and research, and ideas on how to design youth inclusive policies, programs, and services. Before we start, I just want to give you some housekeeping rules. We have with us today UNDP colleagues and partners within and outside the UN system. And also as speakers, we have partners and colleagues who will introduce themselves as they speak. Time-wise, each presenter has around 10 minutes, and we will open the floor for discussion at the end. We are a large group, and please, throughout the chat, do share your questions in the chat box, and Mona and I will read them to the speakers. Be sure to include your name and also preferably your affiliation so that we can identify you later on. You can also, at the end of the webinar, use the raise your hands function in Zoom, and we'll then do the best to unmute you in the discussion so you can speak directly to the panelists, but we are going to take questions at the end. As many of us are working from home, we might have limited bandwidth, and we are therefore suggesting that all participants that are not speaking are keeping their cameras off just to improve the quality of the call, but all speakers are encouraged to keep their videos on. So this chat is being recorded, and it will be available in the communities of practice for UNDP colleagues, and it will be available on the global platform youthforpeace.info for everyone external. And with this, welcome. It is my pleasure just to give the word to Sarah Lister, Head of Governance in the Bureau of Policy and Program Support in UNDP, for her opening remarks. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'm just hoping that you can see me and hear me. Great, fantastic. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are. It is really a great pleasure to be asked to make a couple of minutes of comments at the start of this very interesting meeting, and it's great to have partners joining with UNDP colleagues in this discussion. It is really a very timely discussion. I think there are two things that many of us are thinking about at the moment, and this conversation feeds into both of those. So the first one, and certainly I was thinking about these issues over the weekend, gone are the days when we hope not to think about work at the weekend, if ever there were those days. It is clear that we are what could be called a critical juncture at the moment. Some years ago, I was involved in a paper on looking at inclusive governance and inclusive development and what are the links between the two of them. It was a research and evidence-based paper. And there was a paragraph in it that I largely ignored at the time because it talked about critical junctures or particular tipping points. It talked about in history how a world war or the Black Death or some major global moment had shifted power dynamics, had shifted the way that societies were functioning. And as I was working with others on that paper, I kind of skipped over that bit because I thought, well, there's not a lot that I can do when I'm not likely to live through one of those moments. But now I think we are living through one of those moments. I think we're living at one of those moments where we will look back and we will think the choices that we made at this point were critical for the future of societies, the future of the planet. So then the question becomes, how do we know what those choices are that we should be making? And how do we make sure that those choices are made by those who have power, who can make laws and rules and policies? How do we bring together coalitions of people who want to see a reduction in inequalities, who want to see the planet and people live together in greater harmony? And what is the evidence that we have for approaches that might work, even though we have never been in this situation before? So I think that those two questions really are the backdrop to this discussion. They are, we are at a critical juncture. How do we make sure that the decisions that we make now are the right ones? And what is the evidence backing up those decisions? So young people, which is what we are talking about today, young people are the critical agents of change for sustainable development. And their knowledge, their reach, their innovative solutions are essential for achieving that type of change. But we also know that while young people are agents of change, they also face discrimination and exclusion, and they are facing a disproportionate impact from the results of COVID-19. The structural barriers for young people's agency in society must be addressed so that the response and the recovery to COVID-19 becomes equitable, becomes that game-changing moment that we all want to see. And UNDP is working to promote youth empowerment so that young people can gain the ability, the authority, and the agency to make the decisions and implement the changes in their own lives and societies. We partner with young people, we partner with governments and other stakeholders to bring the voices of youth into policy and decision making. And we do this through our networks and through our country presence to provide concrete opportunities for young people to be those agents of change. We continue to promote young people's voices in democratic governance and in leadership in societies. And we partner with youth in research and data, which enables this, provides the basis for this inclusive policy and programming that responds to the local context and the needs and aspirations of affected people. Participatory approaches are one way that make this research relevant to the experience of youth. We need to understand within each context the impact of the development challenges that are faced and that are faced by young people. It is only by listening and responding to young people that we will understand these issues and work out together a way forward. So I'm very excited by this conversation this morning. I think it is very timely. I know it had its roots in discussions before the pandemic, but I think in this context that we face today, that we are looking at this as a critical turning point and the need to find solutions and to hear voices about the way forward. I think this conversation is more important than ever. So thank you to all those who put it together. Thank you to the partners and the colleagues who are participating. And without further ado, I'll hand it back to Maria for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opening remarks, Sarah. And We're now going into the segment with the speakers, and firstly, I would like to invite Mona Ibrahim, Policy Engagement Officer at the Accelerating Achievement for Africa's Adolescent Hub here at UNDP. Over to you, Mona. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So in my presentation, I'll just be highlighting what the Accelerate Hub is, and what we do and how that links in with our partners. And then I'll hand over to my colleagues, Will and Selenga, to talk about a specific experience in one country, in Ethiopia. So let's get started. So in a nutshell, the Accelerate Hub is a research network focused around Africa's adolescents. Now, this is funded by the UKRI, which is a department within the government of UK dedicated for research. Now, this network is formed by partners across both Europe and Africa, and now increasingly North America as well. What we focus on is identifying and optimizing accelerators for youth development in Africa. Now, a lot of you UNDP colleagues would have heard this term accelerators before, but I will highlight what that means in a bit. Now, we wanted to make our presentation as interactive as possible. So we're going to kind of go out on a limb and try something new. So if you have a phone nearby, or if you can access your web browser, please go on to paulev.com and enter Accelerate 281 to join an online discussion. What this would do is we'll be asking questions throughout this presentation, and you can kind of feed into the conversation. We would really like to hear your thoughts. So I'll just give a few seconds for people to join in. Now, to try it out, we'll be starting with a very rough question. Where are you guys from? If you go on the website, you can just pinpoint where in the world you come from. Oh, we're almost covering all the continents. Great, I'm glad you guys are able to join. Wow, this is a really wealthy crowd. Thank you, and now just keep the browser on, and the questions will change while we go into the presentation. Now, I'll start by kind of covering why, and then who, and then how, in that order throughout my presentation. So why are we focusing on African adolescents? So throughout the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of successes across the continent. A lot more people are getting vaccinated. There's less than 27.4% less people living in extreme poverty. And African governments are actually spending more on education compared to other developing countries. So needless to say, we have achieved a lot. And that's kind of clear throughout the life expectancy across the continent, where it's almost doubled since 1950. And that kind of results in more people surviving, children growing up, going into education and thriving. And what that brings on is a new challenge. Now, African adolescents are expected to reach almost 500 million by the year 2050. That makes them one of the fastest growing populations or subpopulations on Earth. Now, what we're trying to do is kind of focus on them to preemptively contribute to a better 2050 and a better future for the continent. Now, when we zoom into countries specifically, so this example is from South Africa, we can very clearly see that in the demographic curves, where in 1950 it was a solid pyramid. However, it's slowly shifting to a bell shape. This kind of urges for an intervention or a program or a policy that targets this age group. This is why we've started working across Africa, and this is kind of the list of countries we work in so far, along with all our partners, and that includes governments, national civil society, international civil society such as the UNDP, and even regional civil society like the African Union. Now let's try another question. So you should see this question popping up. I want you to just jot in one word. What do you think of when you think of African adolescents? So the most common now are innovative, dynamic, potential, future. And this is exactly the type of image we're trying to paint. This is exactly what the entire hub is looking to create, an image of kind of a dynamic, successful adolescence that can lead into the next generations and kind of be the backbone of the future of Africa. And what we're trying to find through the research across the continent is cost-effective, high-impact services that would positively impact youth across Africa. Now, coming back to this, I'd like to kind of just get into the how, which is through identifying and optimizing accelerators for youth development in Africa. Now, when we think of accelerators, this is a concept that the UNDP created a couple of years ago, and it's been highlighted again in the SDG Progress Report by saying that we could leverage the interlinkages across the SDGs by accelerating progress. Now, by definition, an accelerator is a provision, service, or policy that affects multiple SDGs at the same time. Now, this is a concept that the UNDP has been developing over the last couple of years, but it has never been empirically tested. So that's where we came in. So what we started measuring is kind of the broad impact of things. So for example, when there's a HIV program targeting, for example, teen moms, instead of just seeing its outcomes in HIV outcomes, we also like to see its impact on education, on employment, on parenting, on kind of the range of SDGs, so that it's never just an isolated program, because in reality, nothing is really isolated, but actually a more holistic approach to development. So this is what it looks like in reality. So these are findings from our first proof of concept study, and this was published in the Lancet last year. And what this shows is that we've identified 3 accelerators through this paper. So for example, if we focus on parenting support, that has been found to impact SDG 16, SDG 3, and SDG 5. Likewise with cash transfers and safe schools. Now we took this a little bit further and tried to see what they look like when they're combined. And what that did is almost double the impact. So if you look at the previous slide here, and if you focus on just abuse, abuse was decreased by 17% with safe schools, 12% with cash transfers, and 19% with parenting support. But when these 3 interventions are combined, there's a decrease of almost half of abuse cases. So that was the second main messages. So not just to focus on accelerators, but also to focus on what they do when they're combined, or a layered approach to development, as opposed to individual programs or projects. Now, how do we pick, where do we look for an accelerator? That's where our stakeholders come in. Now, the whole concept of the hub has been co-created and is still continually being developed by multiple partners, the most important of which being African adolescents. Now, we've been having teenage advisory groups across the continent that have been feeding in what are their priorities and what does that mean to them. So for example, when asked, what does SDG 3 mean to you? The adolescents responded, sensitization of healthcare workers, and that's not naturally what we would think of when we think of SDG 3. And that's kind of what's so valuable about this co-creation method we've chosen, is that it highlights things that are actually relevant and not just what we think should be done. Now, finally, how this looks like in action. So over the past few months, life has changed drastically. And following findings from 2 years ago about abuse, we've created some sort of parenting guidelines to prevent that. So the research from 2 years ago shows that whenever children are staying back home over the summer holidays, there's kind of a spike in abuse cases, which is expected because they're always staying at home. Now, what these parenting guidelines do is actually try to block that from happening by focusing on positive parenting. Now, this is just 1 out of 5 manuals, but it focuses on how parents should would better treat their children or would better treat their adolescents. And of course, we couldn't have done that without our partners. So evidence is only half of the way through. And then our partners at UNICEF, at Undp, WHO, took this information and turned it into impact. Now I'd like to kind of, I'm not sure if I should introduce them, but I would like to basically transfer to Will and Selinga, who are focusing on an Ethiopian study that is upcoming in the next few months. And over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Mona. And with that, just to continue the transfer over to Selinga and William, we're looking forward. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Selinga Nisiwe. I'm an early career researcher at the Adolescent Hub, and I'm based in Cape Town. Okay, so I will be co-presenting with my colleague, Will. Next slide. Okay. So before I talk about the upcoming Accelerate Hub study, I would like to give you a brief background on how we go about doing academic research in the context of adolescents from Africa. Okay. So research is used to investigate a specific problem. And generally, there are 6 steps involved in the research process. The first stage involves developing a research question. The purpose of the research question is to give an overview of the problem. It is followed by the research planning and designing stage. This stage involves identifying the study participants, their age, their sex, as well as the region where they are located. Then the third stage, after we have designed the research, is to collect information from the participants. And then this is followed by data analysis. After data analysis, there is writing up of results and presenting the results to partners and colleagues. Then in stage 5 and 6, which is the knowledge action, it involves using this information generated from research to inform decision making and to evaluate and monitor existing programs that are linked to our research question. Okay, next slide. Okay, so moving from the basics of academic research and focusing on the research that we are doing, research into development accelerators in Ethiopia, we have developed our research question, which is how to accelerate progress on global goals for adolescents. Then our aim is to identify programs or provisions to move adolescents forward across a broad range of SDGs. And the definition of an accelerator that we are using for our study is an intervention or circumstance that impacts on 3 or more aspects of an adolescent's life. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we have developed a project timeline as part of our research designing, and so far we have identified the data source, and we have done some literature review, as well as identified some potential accelerators in the data set. And now we are finalizing the data set and doing some descriptive analysis. This will be followed by statistical analysis to test the accelerator effects. And then later on, we would do the write-up and translation of the evidence to impact. Next slide. Okay, so the research, the data that we are using for our study comes from the Young Lives Ethiopia study. The Young Lives study is a project that was set up at the beginning of the new millennium to follow up a group of children as they go through the different stages of life. The Young Lives children are divided into 2 groups, a group of older children and a group of younger children, as you can see from the diagram. And for our study, we are focusing on the older group. Mona, can you click on the circle? Okay. So far, 5 rounds of data has been collected by the Young Lives study, and for our older group of children, they were aged 8 years at round 1 of the survey and aged 22 years at round 5 of the survey. These adolescents reside in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia has 9 regions. Out of the 9 regions, 5 regions were selected for the study. And adolescents from these 5 regions, which were selected from the study, make up about 96% of the total Ethiopian adolescent population. Okay, so at this stage, I'm handing over to my colleague, Will.
Thank you, Selinga. Just to introduce myself, I'm William Ruggaard, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Oxford. So just to build on what Selinga's kind of introduced now, in research, we are limited, well, we have to sort of use the data that we have and analyze that. So what we've done is looked through the Young Lives data that Selinga just introduced to see which SDG indicators are measured in the data so that we might be able to evaluate certain accelerators for their impact. Kind of as a result of this review process, we've identified indicators across 6 SDGs, SDG 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, and 16. And these include indicators like undernourishment for SDG 2, a number of forms of indicators of adolescent health and schooling, which we'll be able to use in our analyses. Mona, if you just want to click onto the next slide. Thank you. So in addition to kind of identifying indicators of SDGs, measurement of SDG indicators, we also needed to see which accelerators we might be able to test in the data. Over the 2000s, Ethiopia implemented a number of policies and programs that were scaled up that would be really, really interesting to evaluate. And those include economic strengthening programs. So a program called the Productive Safety Net Program was implemented, and that's a cash and food payment program for public works. So households can sign up and participate in public works programs and receive cash and food in return. There is also a direct support program that sort of is bolted onto the side of that, that provides food payments for those that are unable to work. So those with disabilities or those that may be pregnant or for a number of other, not unable to work for a number of other reasons. There were also a program was implemented called the Health Extension Program, which is sort of primary prevention, so household visits to sort of raise awareness and provide health education on family planning and sexual and reproductive health and a number of other health areas. There were also educational programs and specifically agricultural extension services whereby households would receive technical advice on agriculture. And this is really important in Ethiopia, which has a large agricultural economy. Thank you, Mona. So next slide. So just to kind of draw us back a second, so I've introduced the SDG indicators that we may be able to focus on, and also the accelerators that we have available in the data and that we may be able to evaluate. And so at this stage, before our data analysis, we don't know which of these programs may be accelerators. And that will really be part of the research process that we as we move forward, and hopefully can sort of feed back to you in the future. If we just move on to the next slide, Mona, so I think at this stage, we have the poll software, so we'd be really interested to hear from you. Specifically which NGOs, institutions or teams you think would benefit from this evidence in Ethiopia. And you can log onto your phones again and list any of those that you think would be useful. Fantastic, yeah. So we've got a whole range of different things coming up. So thank you very much for those. We'll take a review of those and potentially sort of reach out to those partners with the work that we're doing. That's really great and really, really helpful. Thank you. So if Mona, we want to move on to the next slide. So I just wanted to sort of draw this back for a second to kind of where we find ourselves currently with COVID-19, and I think that sort of this work really sits beyond where we are currently with the health crisis and sort of thinking about the rebuilding process. Predictions have been made on sort of financial markets and the financial impact of what COVID-19 will be. And the sort of spillover effects of what happens in markets will inevitably trickle through into government budgets and also non-governmental organizations or everywhere really across society. And so with tighter pockets, it's going to be more and more important that we prioritize interventions or that we know have impacts across as many SDG indicators as possible, as we sort of try and sort of regain momentum in our drive to achieve the SDGs. So that's how we sort of envision this accelerator concept fitting into where we are currently with COVID-19. So Mona, if we could move on to the next slide. And just to say kind of at this point that it's how we've managed in our data to identify measurements of SDG indicators across 6 of the SDGs. But there's a even bigger question that, you know, are we missing out by not focusing on other SDGs and can we find ways to measure those and demonstrate the impact of, or evaluate rather than demonstrate, evaluate the impact of different interventions on all of the SDGs. So Mona, if you so these are sort of future opportunities and thoughts just to leave you with as we sort of try and think about a post-COVID-19 development agenda. And so if you would we would obviously love to hear from you. And if you'd like to get involved or receive updates on the work that we're currently doing, then please do write your name, email and organization into the poll currently. Your answers won't pop up here, so it'll be completely anonymous, and we'll just be able to kind of keep you updated in the future. Thank you, and back to you, Mona.
Thank you very much, Will and Zelinka, for your presentation, and also thank you to all participants for raising good questions in the chat box. We'll get back to those at the end of the webinar. We are having 2 more speakers, and yeah, please rest assured that we are following the questions and that we will have time for discussion at the end. I would like to present the next speaker and say welcome to Nasaiba Othman, who has participated in what is called the Visualize 2030. So now we are also moving from talking about the creation of research and research findings, but also more into how we are having partnerships and young people are using some of the data on SDGs. Nasaiba, over to you for you to present yourself and your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello all, I'm Sabal Mkhlafi, 24 years old, from Yemen. I'm currently work as a freelance social media coordinator and content creator. I was one of the participants in Visualize 2030 hackathon in 2018 as a part of Hikaya team, and we won first place in the hackathon. The hackathon aims to visualize data-driven stories that address development challenges in the whole Arab region or our individual countries within the framework of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. These topics can be related to our ambitious fields or expertise or our individual thoughts. So we create a data-driven visual product that can take the form of poster, infographics, illustrations, videos, or any other kind of visualization. I participated in the hackathon within a team of 3. Our team was called Hikaya, which is Arabic for story. Visualize 2030 introduced us to the Arab Development Portal database and the other official resources that we relied on to get our statistics. Back to the SDGs, we have chosen SDG 3 called Health and Well-Being. we specifically chose to discuss reproductive health and family planning in Yemen, which is a very strong social issue that hasn't been highlighted recently, although it directly affects people's health, education, and financial income. Besides the increase of early marriage percentage between women during the civil war in Yemen, and besides the weakening of the reproductive health services that caused a huge increase in the birth rate to become 3 million newborns in the first 3 years of war, according to UNICEF. I will share with you the video link of our participation in Visualize 2030 in messages. Check it later, please. Data helped us to make the case and the idea we discuss more authentic and genuine. That's why data, in my beliefs, has enabled us to produce more impactful content. We used several indicators to deliver several messages in the video, as well as using data to build a futuristic vision for the topic. Visually, we aimed to present the video in a way that looks and feels familiar to the community, the graphics styles, colors, dialogue, and the accent. After the end of Visualize 2030, we continued in the same approach within Hikaya's platforms, which we aim to be a digital platform that produces and publishes data-driven animated stories that discuss issues that matter the community with the aim of raising awareness in society. This is how we produce our second story in collaboration with RNW Media, Radio Netherlands Worldwide, which is a Dutch organization that works all around the world in building digital communities for creating social change. A few weeks after I started to work with the RNW Media as a social media editor for their digital platform in Yemen, which is locally known as Manassati 30. The project aimed to build a culture of peace, coexistence, and dialogue with Yemeni youth using social media platforms. My role was to produce and write content based on the results of the questionnaire we publish monthly. I believe that using official resources and references always make the content more authentic and genuine to the audience and make them more open to comprehend and interact. In general, data helps to increase interactions and engagement, as well as being a major advocacy tool because data helps us to have a brave opinion, a strong argument, and a clear vision. In any debate, both sides' arguments will be definitely stronger when they are based in facts, references, and official statistics. But in our recent world, everything is becoming faster and simpler. Instead of a newspaper, people are using social media, and instead of reading books, people are hearing podcast. In visual communications and digital marketing, experts are trying to attract people with the simplest possible to make sure to reach the largest amount possible of the young people we are targeting. We can't rely on them reading and analyzing reports. Instead, we produced a short animation prototype, less than 2 minutes, telling an interesting story based on facts and statistics we wanted to present using simple infographics. And I think that this kind of data-driven entertaining media materials can be used in more series and topics to highlight some facts and numbers for awareness's purpose. I think that using these methods was the key that helped us win the hackathon in the first place. During the recent coronavirus pandemic, we at Hikaya are currently trying to make some self-efforts to produce educational content within our typical theme to raise awareness in society, as we believe that using data-driven content this time will be a major solution to prevent the spirit of remorse. Hikaya, just like any other initiative or project, needs financial support to stay sustainable and to continue its productions and efforts. That's where most of the fund going in and out in Yemen focuses on humanitarian work, and it's very hard to convince donors with offices in Yemen to fund a digital project. Anyhow, we are very ambitious ambitious in building new connections and partnerships, aiming to create visual content that meets youth needs and motivates them to interact with data and statistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nusaiba. And I also think it's a really interesting point, because we hear a lot from our colleagues in UNDP around the world how they are partnering with young people in awareness raising and prevention of COVID-19. And it's good to hear from your experience on how to use the data-driven content to make it accessible and familiar in Yemen. Thank you very much. And we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Vladica Jovanovic, project leader in the Regional Youth Cooperation Office in Western Balkans. Over to you, Vladica.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. So as Maria said, I'm Vladica, and I'm a project leader at RICO in a joint project where the UNDP, UNFPA, and UNICEF lead a regional project aimed at supporting Western Balkan on its path of reconciliation. And I sort of cover the RICO's portion of that project. Now, next slide. So what is RICO? RICO is a regional youth cooperation office, an intergovernmental organization. It's an independently run institutional mechanism founded by Western Balkan 6 participants: Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. We were founded in 2016 in Paris with a mandate of building cooperation and fostering reconciliation between youth of the region by using mobility, youth exchange programs primarily, as one of our core tools in this process. Our work is built on the premise that through shared experiences, cooperation, and ongoing exchange, new pathways can be built to support reconciliation among people and youth who would otherwise remain trapped in the past. Violent conflicts of the Balkan region had ethnic nationalism as one of the core factors for the tragedies Balkan region has experienced in the 90s. And it has resulted in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo's ethnic division now being institutionalized through a system of power sharing between different ethnic groups. While in North Macedonia, there has been its own ethnic-based conflict in 2001. And on the other hand, left out of the Yugoslavia wars, Albania has been struggling to overcome decades-long isolations and consequences of its communist rule. So building on that reality and sort of on one side and building on the successful model of Franco-German Youth Office, on the other, RICO was established with a mission, and that's on the next slide, to support regional exchange of youth and their sharing of ideas as a ground for future cooperation based on values of coexistence, tolerance, and human rights approach. Mona, next slide. So in RICO, we strongly believe that youth are at the forefront of the change. They are the core change agents which should be creating the culture of mobility, intercultural exchange, and reconciliation. We see youth as active contributors to wider processes of democracy development, social and economic prosperity, EU integration process, and peace building within the region. The role of youth within RICO is evidenced not only in the hiring young professionals in managerial and other positions of the organization, but also in the co-management principles of our governing board, where we have a co-management principle with youth representatives governing RICO together with the government representatives from Western Balkans 6. Next slide. Slide. Yeah, okay. So it's been 20 years since the conflict in the Balkans and almost 30 since different Western Balkans 6 have started their path from communist to democratic regimes. And you might wonder, why is peace building agenda still needed and prioritized, and why we are capitalizing on the current peace potential of the region so relevant today and doing it primarily with youth? The reason is that the recent past continues to shape the narratives and experiences of young people's lives. Addressing the past through different transitional justice, dealing with the past or human rights mechanisms is not enough. The youth needs new experiences to better understand, address, and overcome those inherited narratives they grew up with. They need to create spaces where they can voice their perspectives and take on an active role in shaping up their realities. Now, the international community has recognized, it has recognized that young people have an active role, an integral role to play in peace building, as asserted in UN's Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. And the Missing Peace study showed that without a clear evidence-based youth perspectives and attitudes towards peace, our understanding of youth role is often shaped by stereotypical thinking. Young people also viewed that skewed presentations of youth limited their ability to elevate their role in sustaining peace and work on promoting peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. Slide. This is why promotion of youth priorities and sustaining it is critical to strengthening the reconciliation efforts, overall stabilization and preparation for EU accession in the Western Balkans, and that's at the core of this project. Our joint project invests in RICO as the regional mechanism for promotion of cooperation, but the project works on building capacities and creating new methodologies in working with schools, with youth organization, and with a special attention on how to reach vulnerable youth in achieving all of this, all of our mandate. What I want to highlight here is the fourth box for those of you who are looking at the presentation, which is the initiative that I'm here to present today. The initiative focuses around youth-led action research on young people's priorities in peace and security from the region. I'm saying action research because the data collected from this research will be put to use to impact policymaking and peace-building programming in the region, and to achieve a renewed and youth-led peace advocacy and messaging on critical issues that youth themselves prioritize surrounding conflict legacies. Slide. The important note that we want to share about the study is that it's taking a participatory approach where we gave a group of 23 Western Balkan young people representing different backgrounds an opportunity to work with us on designing the study, and who are also part of the data analysis and following advocacy efforts. The research is currently in design phase and will identify how the effects of the conflicts in the sub-region are still represented in young people's experiences and how they act based on those circumstances. It will define how young women and young men view issues of security, safety, violence, gender roles, inequality, conflict, reconciliation, and peace, and what their views, aspirations, and priorities for the future are. It will also inform new interventions in building and sustaining peace, as well as inform advocacy activities of relevance to the youth of the region, the so-called youth agenda. This research also serves as a baseline for us at RICO and to other initiatives focused on strengthening capacities of young people and their potential to lead change. Slide. So an important question is, of course, how does our research foster inclusivity? It fosters it by involving youth actors and activists, youth organizations, and experts in jointly developing the methodology and analyzing the data of the research, as well as engaging youth in focus group discussion and in advocacy activities. In doing so, we believe that we are bringing youth voices to decision-making tables where discussions on policies and programs take place. And we are enabling that the programming efforts engage youth more based on evidence and bottom-up, by in so contributing to the overall creation of societies that include both youth better and give youth better opportunities and space to envision a positive future. Slide. Now, how actually going through this process looks like in practice. We have selected the Youth Co-Design team back in January. Representative group of young people who are able to relate to different socioeconomic layers of society and reach those most vulnerable and marginalized. And we started with a training on what basic concepts and conflict analysis are. Research is currently in the process of design and validation. So the draft methodology and questions we've developed are analyzed, challenged, modified, and validated by youth, step by step. It will also, the next step will be that once research is rolled out, when we come to the qualitative portion, this group of youth will actually be given an opportunity to join and co-lead focus groups discussions. And an outcome of all of this will be advocacy initiatives that will result based on the data that we get, spreading this sort of in a spillover effect to other youth actors in the region. And the idea of the whole process was to enable youth empowerment from the creation of the survey and the research up to the very end, where it actually is reflected and adopted, first advocated and then adopted youth-oriented policies. Slide. In terms of COVID-19, it has really impacted how this work looks like for us in these last few months. First, what can be learned from our approach is that what we want to say that there is a very practical impact of COVID for our initiative, because our initiative is highly about reconciliation and trust building, and as an integral part of its human-to-human interaction, which now, of course, happens mostly online. So how do we do it? Youth consultations happen online. They happen on this very same platform on Zoom. In terms of how we work with questions and how we modify the research itself, we are doing it collaboratively in real time by using Google Drive. We are facilitating the process in a very passive way with the young people by letting them take the wheel of the co-design process. And we aim to kind of support their leading of the process more and more in the next stages. We have been able to see in this last month and a half since this process has started and it's majorly being implemented online, that youth is able to adjust easily, innovate effortlessly, and able to step up and take the lead with just like a little set of the space. We don't believe that it's such a novel approach to put young people in the center of designing, implementation, and delivery, but we do believe that this is a testament to the fact that young people can and have the capacity to step up to challenges, be engaged in their societies, and inspire their peers, if they're given proper tools and space to do that. One other important message from our initiative is that young people are an integral and useful part of society. So any successful responses, including those to the COVID pandemic, should take into account the voices of young people. And finally, and with this I close, in times of crisis and fear, and when social cohesion in communities may suffer, the resilience and perseverance of youth peace builder and active youth, which we have also witnessed in this project, can and should be mobilized for community efforts during and in the aftermath of this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laditya, for your presentation, and also thank you for the questions that keeps coming up. We are now through all the presentations by speakers, and we have 30 minutes left, which is great because now we'll have time for a conversation. Following the chat box throughout the presentations, we have a number of questions, and I'm going to start grouping them a little bit. So we are going to start with 2 questions that goes to all of the speakers. And then there are some questions directly for Will, Silinga, and Mona. And then there is one question for Laditya as well. So we're going to start with those for all of you. And one of these questions related to how do you ensure to reach the most marginalized young people in research and data collection, also during COVID-19. So we would like to hear your reflections on that. That's the first question. And the second question that goes to all of you is how you mobilize communities to engage in data collection, to engage in co-creating research designs. So one question on reaching the most marginalized and another question on mobilizing communities. Maybe Mona, would you like to go?
Should I start? Okay. Actually, so I'd like to kind of come back to the teenage advisory groups that we have. So I think we're joined here in the call by Leslie, who's one of the coordinators for the teenage advisory groups. So Leslie, if you're here, just give a shout out. If not, I can speak to this.
Hi everyone, hi Mona.
Hiya, so Leslie, would you like to take a shot at this?
Sure, absolutely. And just to say, unfortunately, I'm not so familiar with the Ethiopia study, so it would be great to hear Will and Slinga and your thoughts as well, Mona. But basically, our teen advisory groups at the Accelerate Hub are longstanding engagements we have with adolescents and young people. The first one was developed about 12 years ago as part of a study that was trying to quantify the impacts of parental HIV-related illness or AIDS deaths on children. And since then, we've developed other teen advisory groups in different parts of Southern and Eastern Africa, and the recruitment criteria in terms of age as well as different factors that might make young people more vulnerable or marginalized differ. But we have some with young parents, some with adolescents living with HIV. And what we basically do is we try and inform our research as much as possible through a participatory approach, with the belief that when young people are engaged meaningfully, that is given the proper space and tools, that they can participate in really, really innovative and appropriate ways. So what we've done is we have these standing groups, and we started by really doing a lot of work with them to learn from them about concepts of research, power, participation, and adolescence. And because we have those strong relationships with young people, we've been informing our COVID response through them. So our first question when COVID came about was, what, if anything, should we do to try and understand young people's experiences during this time? And we did what we usually do, which is we asked young people themselves. So we called a subset of the teen advisory groups to get their perspectives. And they gave us some really interesting and meaningful perspectives, which informed some new research questions. And they were very specific about the methodologies we should be using as well, mostly relating to calling and Facebook, so that they can set the terms of engagement that work for them, and those who have trouble accessing phones or data actually advised us on how we could include them meaningfully. So I think the short answer is we start by asking young people, and then we look to respond and co-create spaces based on their inputs. I'd be happy to share as they come out, any research tools we have. We're starting up a Facebook, closed Facebook groups with the concept of an alien time capsule. That is an online forum where young people can feed in about their experiences during this time, but using some sci-fi imagery to create a little bit of distance as well. So we're trying to use different participatory methods using photo voice, narrative, and other sorts of prompts to hear their thoughts during this time about both methods as well as what their experiences and challenges are to inform future research.
Yeah, sorry, Maria, I'm happy to move on and kind of speak from the Ethiopia angle as well. I'll put my camera back on. So just a bit of context for the audience. Mona, myself, Silinga, and Leslie that just spoke are all part of the same hub and conduct research together in sort of collaboratively. So, the study that myself and Silinga just presented in this is slightly standalone. It's part of that, but a study that's ongoing as part of a larger hub that Mona presented on. So some of the studies are based in South Africa, and those are largely informed by the participatory methods that Leslie just spoke about. Whereas some of the other studies are not necessarily able to draw on the same wealth of information that Leslie spoke about there in terms of having participatory tag groups. But we are able to, so for example, in Ethiopia, we can draw on lessons learned from the tag groups that Leslie presented on and try to prioritize research along those lines. We also, in terms of kind of how the questions were also sort of around how do we reach the most marginalized. We've reached out to stakeholders in Ethiopia to try and identify who those populations may be. The other slight issue is with quantitative data science. It's very hard to actually research truly marginalized groups because sometimes you may not have enough information on those marginalized groups. Of course, we'll always try and do our best to generate evidence around them as they are a priority group for doing that for. In terms of how do we mobilize communities for research design, I think it's an incredibly important question and is something that we're trying to sort of, I'm sort of thinking about as part of a grant application in terms of trying to bring adolescents into specifically into quantitative research design, which is slightly more abstract and it relies on being able to communicate statistics quite effectively and those sorts of things. So it's something that we're aiming to do moving forward, absolutely.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Mona and Leslie as well. Nusaiba, would you like to reflect upon reaching the most marginalized young people as well as how to mobilize communities? In that case, I think we'll go to Ladija first, if you can hear us.
Yeah, I can hear you. So, I mean, I can speak a bit about the research, but I think in terms of how we came to the Youth Co-Design team, which sort of was advertised for and selected according to an internal principles where we really looked very heavily to have vulnerable and minority groups represented. in the group so that we can actually have a better picture of what we are designing. And then I can also speak a bit about how RICO does it in general. When it comes to the youth co-design team and the research, in order to really make sure that we are reaching young people, even the sample that we are looking at, besides having a representative sample, we are sort of tapping into the communities that work directly with marginalized, vulnerable, and hard to reach youth groups, so that we can source out these young people into focus group discussion and tap more into their experiences and perceptions of the topics we're covering by the research. And I hope that's an interesting suggestion for others. When it comes to RICO in general, we have been in the first few years tapping more into the mainstream young population. And one of the reasons this project was designed in a way that we are also supported with UNFPA in the project is sort of to have a whole initiative focused on reaching more the youth from these communities, engaging them in training, in spillover local communities. So no sort of in building up our outreach to these communities, but actually making these young people change agents and giving them the space to demonstrate what's relevant for their community, but to also do something about it. One of the reasons that's part of the methodology of the project, but for RICO in general, through our open calls, which is as a grant instrument, one of the core ways RICO affects change in the region, we are heavily looking to support projects which come from the marginalized and vulnerable communities, because then these young people and these organizations are part of our pool, and we can and we do heavily rely on them to share with us the experience of their target groups. And we've done we've supported Roma organizations, we've supported trans or organizations working with trans, intersex, and gender variant youth. So this is how we are trying to extend beyond what's sort of usually expected, the usual culprits or suspects. I will say there was a question in the chat about how are we reaching young people from remote areas and people who don't have good access to internet. And in truth, I don't think we are. I think the people that we have access to, especially during we do have access to them outside of the pandemic circumstances, but to claim that in the pandemic circumstances we are effectively be able to reach those who don't have access to internet while we're all stuck at homes, it would not be a fair claim to make. So this is, I think, a huge sort of challenge in the upcoming times, and how to really, when we are left with online tools as primary tools of collaboration, how do we reach those who actually don't have access to them?
Thank you very much, Laditya. And maybe to continue with you, because there was another question for RICO, which was on how do you define advocacy in your work? And could you, even though we know your study and research is ongoing, could you also say something about how you think it is going to be implemented? So a question on how do you define advocacy and what is going to happen when implementation takes off? Thank you.
Yeah, so once the research is out, we will, of course, present it in a big regional dialogue event. But the idea is that there is a call from young people, and especially from different communities, to be able to apply for advocacy initiatives they want to do in their local communities. So it's like a multi-layer process. We have the regional aspect, the national aspect, and then the local activities as well. We need to do it in this like step-by-step approach, so as to really give a lot of time for young people to participate at a level which they are comfortable with, but to also sort of build up their courage to take on the advocacy initiatives in their local communities with youth and grassroots organizations as their supporters to like to a next level, sort of that they take the lead of these activities while they get some sort of back-end support from those who have more advocacy experience and who are already working in some NGO or other structures on the ground. That's the most brief way we can share right now. The nitty-gritty of a lot of that is to be developed, and of course will depend on what the experiences of the entire research rollout phase are. But we are happy to update on the research as the initiative continues in the upcoming months.
Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to a number of questions for Mona, Will, and Selinga. First, we had Priya from UNDP asking, what are data links and gaps between health and governance that you have identified in context of COVID-19? And then a question for Will and Selinga is, how did you factor in COVID-19 in your research design? We had Claudia asking, what innovative solutions have you applied for data collection? Also followed by Antonina from Eval Youth asking, how have you used youth consultations or involvement in the research strategy for Ethiopia? And then there is also a question which comes back to what Will have already spoken a bit to about the data availability, what was there, what was not there, and what data did you use? If you think there's more you would like to say to that, we also had a couple of questions on that. So these were a number. Would you like me to repeat it, or are you okay to give a go and then I'll just follow up? We're going to do it like that. Over to you.
I mean, I guess we can do it like this.
Great.
So with governance and health, there's been such an interlinked relationship between these two in country levels. And I'm sure anyone who's working on the COVID response would have noticed this, that what is, in many scenarios, governance within health ministries is not too aligned. There's a couple of groups working on the same thing separately. So there is a strong overlap between the two currently, and they do have extremely aligned goals, but people aren't really working together in a country level. So I would, so this is where we're starting to push for academia to be that connecting factor. So that's we've currently started doing that in South Sudan, a bit in the Zambia as well. So these are currently kind of on-ground translations of what academia can do. And it's actually something that any organization can do, especially implementation programs and people doing outreach. And this actually, there has been a mobilization of youth across, well, I can only speak from Africa, but across Africa, we do see like a lot of youth groups have redirected their initiatives, started supporting their communities, but in not in a coordinated fashion. So nothing that's coordinated with ministries or coordinated with governmental entities. So that would be a good starting point for that.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. Thank you for that question. I think I'm not an expert on governance, but I think that the research that we're doing speaks nicely to it, especially in the context of when we're thinking about health specifically. I think that COVID-19 has really illustrated how it really can't just be about one particular area. And we need to be thinking beyond just one sector, i.e. health, and sharing information, updates, planning responses in a coordinated way that relies on us thinking beyond just our own areas. And the accelerator concept is specifically pushing us to do that. And so I think that from a governance perspective, that's really kind of where our kind of work might kind of be able to sort of push some thinking.
Thank you.
Could I also, sorry, just jump in for 1 second as well, just to add on to what Mona and Will were saying?
You're welcome, Leslie.
Thank you. I guess something that we found quite interesting also in thinking about responding to COVID-19 and the methods that we would use to do that and the research questions to ask. We had assumptions about what young people would want to talk about. We thought maybe they needed more information or more accurate information. We had kind of health services related questions. And I think to both Will and Mona's points about it not being about one thing, what we actually heard from young people was that COVID-19 is one aspect of already very rich and complex lives. So being quite intentionally broad and allowing young people to direct the engagement in terms of what they thought was appropriate actually allowed us to learn quite a bit that we wouldn't necessarily, and take kind of research and questions and methods in a direction that we wouldn't necessarily have done if we didn't ask right at the beginning. So just also thinking about that a little bit as we start moving into directed COVID responses, about how we can also be intentionally broad so as not to miss important parts of the puzzle.
Thank you, Leslie. Zelinga, would you like to come in as well?
No, not at this stage, Maria.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much. We also got a question from
Maria, sorry to kind of, there were several other questions that I'm happy to kind of just try and answer. I tried to note down as many of the ones that you listed, and maybe you can, if there are ones that I miss. One of them was related to kind of, did we predict COVID or consider COVID in our research design for this particular study? And no, we didn't. This concept sort of really started in January and is really, unfolded as COVID has become the global pandemic that it is now. How we might be able to kind of think about it in terms of the research that we're doing, I think that I tried to sort of speak a little bit to that. We're slightly limited, and perhaps we didn't make this clear enough in the presentation, that we're using secondary data. So the data has already been collected, and it was collected between sort of 2002 and around sort of 2015. It was on one of the slides that Zelinga presented. And so we can draw lessons from that data and then apply those to sort of where we might go from here. So what we're really doing is thinking about this informing the sort of the next steps rather than how we might respond now, which I think are equally important to be thinking about. Obviously, most attention should definitely be directed to the situation currently, but there's still that question of what next. And then there were several other questions, Maria, that I'm happy to kind of have a go at as well.
There was a question about innovative solutions to data collection, but as you say, you're using data that's already there, but maybe you could bring it together then. How is the relation between the data you're using and then the teenage advisory panels? And is that a form of validation to co-create the direction and identify the areas of work, or how are these two parts coming together in the hub?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think this is a really interesting question, and not one that I can answer, but I know that Leslie's probably holding her finger over the unmute button. because we've been hearing some really interesting lessons from the work that Leslie's been doing with the tag team in South Africa. So I think I'd let Leslie answer that question.
Hi, sorry, I actually had to find the unmute button. Will you, I think you overestimated me, Anna. But basically to say it's an ongoing conversation, and I think one that we would love to hear from other colleagues on as well, including those who have presented today, because I think it's quite challenging to both include a responsiveness and very kind of localized engagements that use kind of deep process-oriented participatory approaches, and then to extrapolate from those in a way that holds the meaning. So we're still working on that. But basically, we have both kind of a methodological and an empirical arm to how we're starting to think about this. So one is having young people actually just tell us how they want to participate, and they have done so in many different ways. So recently they've been telling us how they want to participate on social media, but previously a variety of different arts-based and more traditional qualitative methods. And can we then link that into our research designs right at the beginning and then throughout? And then the second question, I think, is more empirical in nature and something that's we'll need to think more about going forward, which is what type of questions and issues do young people want us to be focusing on? And I think we're just starting to think about that in relation to the COVID response, based on some very preliminary findings coming out of one Southern African and one Eastern African country.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And we are about to run out of time, so I would also like to get back to Vladitya before we end, and maybe ask you, Vladitya, what do you actually see the role of RUCO, the role you are having as an organization in the pandemic in terms of responding to governance and peace issues around the COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a million-dollar question on what organization and a mechanism as RICO can do in this bigger processes. What we are trying to do always, but especially now, is to sort of not cave in to this maybe implicit pressures that things should be coming top down. Or that those with the decades-long experiences should lead all the processes. We are trying to keep youth at the center to show that the young people of our region, but I mean this applies to young people in general, have the capacity to take an active and a leading role in many of the processes, but also that it's the young people that we should primarily look at to see how we can handle all of these challenges, especially because this is the generation that grew up with digitalization processes, with online tools, with online communications, and they can sort of help the rest of the generations adapt to this life or functional solutions which can be implemented not just during this pandemic, but also in the aftermath of this or in the future pandemics that we might encounter. So essentially that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to still keep young people at the center of the stage and always shedding light on what they're doing, and especially the grassroots initiatives that are working bottom up even throughout this pandemic. And there is a question right now in the chat that I can respond to directly. So we are defining young people based on the EU definition of youth. So everyone between 14 and 30 years of age is considered a young person. And that's how it's also identified in RICO's statutory documents. It doesn't mean that we do not work with others. We very rarely work with younger groups, but we do work with general population and those who are working with youth workers or professionals, but the young people themselves are our core constituency.
Thank you very much. And here at the end of the webinar, I would like to ask Mona if we could, are we ready to ask a final question for the participants, not the speakers?
Yes. So just to kind of help coordinate efforts, we were wondering if any of you are already working with youth on the COVID-19 response. And if so, please just do point out where you're working. And hopefully our presenters will be able to see that.
And while we get the results in on the map on the screen, I might just say a few words of thank you to our speakers. And for everyone who have participated and really contributed to this chat on youth partnerships and research and data, a game changer for an inclusive COVID-19 response. There has been a number of key points highlighted, both from how we see the different projects adapting to the context of COVID-19, as well as a number of different approaches on really co-creating research and data together with young people, both to include them, but also to make sure there is space for young people to engage as the agents of change that they really are. So this has also really come into the question of how we're doing our work, and in that way, how we can better provide concrete opportunities for young people to have a say in their lives and in their societies. So thank you very much for that. And a special thank you shall go to Eski and Andrea, who are the facilitators of the Community of Practice on respectively governance and health and HIV, as well as to Noelia Richard, Mona, and Nicolas for supporting the organizing of this chat. And of course, a huge thank you to the speakers for their excellent presentations. And I'd just like to remind you that the presentations along with this recording will be available on the youthforpeace.info website and the Community of Practice pages in UNDP. But let's have a look at the map. It seems that we are having all regions of the world covered here. That is wonderful for a Monday morning for New York time, a Monday webinar on youth research data in the context of COVID-19. Thank you very much, everyone. And let's continue the conversations. Don't hesitate to reach out and we will put you in touch with the speakers and colleagues. Thank you and bye for now.
Thank you, Maria, for organizing this.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.